The land had been in the family for generations, stretching out beneath the southern sun, rich and dark, fertile with the memory of those who came before. It was not just soil, it was history, legacy, and dignity wrapped into every blade of grass, every stone, and every tree that had stood through storms and seasons. For the man who now tended it, this land was more than property. It was sacred ground passed down to him through hardship, resilience, and the quiet pride of a family that had endured when the world tried to break them. But the world, as it often does, found new ways to test his endurance. When the Homeowners Association first arrived, their language was smooth, their promises dressed in the polished charm of developers who claimed to be building a better future. They spoke of community, of growth, of turning the quiet countryside into something modern, bustling, and bright. They came not with respect but with contracts, maps, and visions that erased his presence. What he owned was an inconvenience to their plans, a patch of earth that stood in the way of their blueprint. At first, he resisted with words. He reminded them that the land was his, that it had always been his family's. But the HOA board did not listen. They nodded politely, then returned with surveyors and bulldozers, as though his voice was little more than background noise. Where his cattle once grazed, concrete foundations began to rise. Where his trees once provided shade, streets were carved with asphalt. And before long, 35 houses stood upon his land, shining with new paint, manicured lawns, and the false confidence of people who thought they belonged there. The pain of it cut deep, not only because they had trespassed, but because of what it symbolized. Once again, a black man's claim to dignity and ownership was disregarded, erased as though his heritage and history meant nothing. For the families moving into those homes, the land was simply real estate. For him, it was blood, memory, and legacy. Yet the HOA board dismissed him, even mocked him when he tried to protest. They said he had no chance, that the courts would not side with him, that men like him rarely won when it came to battles against money, influence, and power. But what they did not know was that this land held more than memory. Beneath the ground, behind the hills, there lay a dam, an old but powerful structure that his father and uncles had built decades earlier. It was meant to preserve water for the dry summers, to ensure the crops and livestock never withered under the sun's glare. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than part of the landscape. But to him, it was control. It was a reminder that his family had not only survived, they had built. They had engineered, they had created something lasting. The houses went up quickly. Families moved in, bringing their furniture, their children, their expectations of quiet suburban life. But he watched it all unfold with a silence that many mistook for weakness. They did not see the quiet fire that grew within him, a flame fueled by generations of struggle and the unshakable knowledge that he was not powerless. When the HOA finally sent their letter declaring the land officially under community management, he held it in his hands for a long time. The paper was thin, the ink smug, as though their declaration was the final word. But he knew better. Land does not belong to ink on paper. It belongs to those who have nurtured it, bled for it, and understood its every breath. And so he made his choice. The morning was quiet when he walked to the dam. The sky was painted in shades of gray, the air thick with the scent of rain. He stood there, staring at the massive gates that had been closed for so long, holding back the waters that had grown restless, waiting. His hand rested on the old iron lever, the metal cold beneath his skin. For a moment, he thought of his father, of the stories told around the fire, about holding on to dignity, no matter how much the world tried to strip it away. He thought of his mother, who had walked those fields with pride, saying that no one could ever take from them what God had given. And then he pulled. The gates groaned as though awakened from a deep sleep, and the waters surged forward, rushing with a force that could not be denied. Downstream, the flow cut across the manicured lawns, the new driveways, the polished wooden fences. The 35 homes stood no chance. Within minutes, water filled basements, lifted furniture, and sent families scrambling onto rooftops. The HOA board, who once spoke with arrogance, now stood powerless, watching as their empire washed away in the current of a man they thought they had defeated. But this was not merely revenge. It was a lesson written in water and stone. The man did not smile as he watched. His face held no glee, only solemnity, because he knew the gravity of what had been done. He had not simply destroyed homes, he had made a statement. A reminder that when dignity is trampled, when legacy is disrespected, there will always be consequences. News spread quickly, carried by whispers, headlines, and the anger of those who had lost their new homes. Some called him reckless, dangerous, criminal, but others understood. They saw not a man breaking the law, but a man standing against the centuries-old story of land taken from black families, of property stolen, of heritage erased by greed and arrogance. They saw courage even in destruction and a determination that demanded respect. The HOA had thought they were untouchable. They had believed their power, their paperwork, and their wealth made them immune to accountability. But they had underestimated the resilience of a man who knew what it meant to have nothing but his land, and the will to defend it by any means necessary. For days afterward, he walked the flooded grounds, the water slowly receding, the houses broken, hollow, and ruined. It was not beauty, but it was justice. And as he stood there, his boots sinking into the mud, he whispered a prayer, not for the homes, not for the HOA, but for his ancestors, that they might see from above that their bloodline had not faltered, that their son had stood when the world tried to make him kneel. In the days that followed, the floodwater left behind more than shattered homes and broken fences. It carried with it the heavy silence of reckoning, a silence that pressed down on the new community that had once been full of excitement and laughter. The lawns were ruined, the driveways cracked with debris, the bright walls of their houses stained with the brown scars of mud. 35 families found themselves displaced, shocked and outraged, demanding answers. And yet, when the local authorities arrived, when reporters stuck microphones in his face, the man stood firm. His words were not shouted, but spoken with the weight of a truth too old to be ignored. This land was mine. My father's before me. My grandfather's before him. You built on what you never owned, and now the land has reminded you it cannot be stolen. The HOA board, furious and desperate, tried to paint him as a villain. They spoke of damages, of recklessness, of lives put in danger, but their anger could not hide the fact that their foundation had been illegitimate from the beginning. They had ignored his voice, ignored the history of the soil beneath their feet, and believed that wealth could overwrite truth. Their arrogance had led them here, and the world was beginning to notice. News outlets dug into the story, uncovering documents that showed how the HOA had pushed through the development without his consent, how officials had been complicit in overlooking his claims of ownership. What they had tried to frame as a simple act of defiance now became a much larger story, a story about race, about power, about the long legacy of land theft from black families in America. People began to come forward not only in his town but across the country. Stories surfaced of black farmers who had lost acres to shady deals, families whose properties had been swallowed by highways, developers, and banks. The man's act, though destructive, had struck a nerve that ran deeper than one community. It had reopened a wound that America often tried to cover with polite silence. For the man himself, it was not about attention. He had never sought fame or recognition. All he wanted was what had been his all along, the dignity of his family's land, the acknowledgement of his right to exist without being pushed aside. When cameras followed him, when neighbors whispered his name with a mixture of fear and respect, he did not boast. Instead, he walked the ruined fields quietly, planting seeds again where he could, mending fences, and tending to what the flood had left untouched. His silence spoke louder than any protest sign, but the consequences were real. Lawsuits were filed against him, the HOA pressing charges with every ounce of influence they could muster. The families who had lost their homes demanded compensation. Courtrooms became battlegrounds where lawyers argued over deeds, contracts, and liability. Many expected him to be crushed under the weight of it all, just as so many before him had been. Yet something unexpected happened. Civil rights groups began to take notice. Lawyers who had fought long battles for land justice reached out, offering to represent him. Historians stepped forward with records, proving the legitimacy of his family's claim. Community leaders raised their voices, saying that his act, however extreme, was the inevitable result of a system that had ignored black landowners for far too long. The courtroom became a stage where history itself was on trial. The HOA argued that progress demanded sacrifice, that development was necessary, that one man could not stand in the way of growth. But his lawyers countered with a truth that shook the very foundation of their argument. Growth cannot come at the cost of theft, and progress is not progress if it erases the people who have held the soil for generations. Witness after witness spoke, some with trembling voices, some with tears in their eyes, telling of ancestors who had been stripped of their land, of farms lost to predatory practices, of dignity trampled in the name of profit. The man sat quietly through it all, his weathered hands folded in front of him, the weight of his ancestors heavy on his shoulders. He was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every story, buried beneath asphalt and concrete, for every forgotten name carved into land records never honored. And when the verdict came, it was not what the HOA had expected. The court recognized his ownership of the land, acknowledging the wrongdoing that had allowed the development to proceed without his consent. Though he was held responsible for damages caused by the flood, the ruling carried a power beyond money. It was a recognition at last that his family's legacy could not simply be swept aside. For him, that recognition mattered more than anything else. Money could come and go, homes could be built and destroyed, but acknowledgement, that was eternal. It meant that his children, his grandchildren, and those who came after would know the truth. They would know that their bloodline had not surrendered, that when the world tried to erase them, they had resisted. As time passed, the land healed. The floodwaters receded, the fields dried, and nature began to reclaim what had been scarred. The 35 homes, most of them abandoned, stood as hollow reminders of arrogance, their walls crumbling, their paint peeling, their windows shattered by storms. The HOA dissolved, its power broken, its members scattered. And in the middle of it all, the man remained, tending the earth as his father had once taught him, his figure strong against the horizon. But his story did not fade. Across the country, his name became a quiet symbol, not of destruction but of resistance, not of vengeance but of dignity reclaimed. Young men and women spoke of him when they talked about justice, about standing firm when no one else believed in them. Activists pointed to his act as proof that silence can only be ignored for so long, before it rises like water, unstoppable and fierce. He never sought to be a hero. Heroes are often remembered, but he wanted something deeper, to ensure his family's story would not be erased. And in that he succeeded. His land remained his, sacred as ever, rooted in the strength of those who had come before. In the quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and the sky burned with the colors of dusk, he would walk to the dam once more. He would sit by the rushing water, listening to its endless song. It reminded him of his ancestors' voices, steady, unbroken, flowing through time. And as he watched the water ripple into the distance, he knew that their spirit lived on, not only in him but in the land itself. The HOA had built 35 homes on his soil, believing they had claimed it. But in the end, it was the land that had spoken, reminding them all that ownership is not about papers or power. Ownership is about memory, sacrifice, and the unyielding truth of who belongs. And so his story endured, not as a tale of houses lost, but as a testament to a man who refused to be erased. A black man who stood against the weight of history, who opened the floodgates of justice when the world tried to drown him in silence. Years passed, and the scars of that flood softened into the earth. Nature, with its quiet patience, covered what was broken with new growth. Weeds crept through cracked foundations, trees spread their roots into abandoned driveways, and wildflowers bloomed where playgrounds had once stood. The ghostly shells of the 35 homes were slowly consumed, reminders of arrogance reclaimed by the soil they had tried to claim. For outsiders, it looked like ruin, but for the man, it was restoration. The land was returning to itself, cleansing the trespass, breathing again as it had for generations. In time, people stopped speaking of it as the flood. Instead, they began to call it the day the land spoke. It became more than an event. It became a symbol. At kitchen tables and community meetings, in classrooms and church gatherings, his story was told and retold. For black families who had known the sting of property stolen, it was a story of defiance that carried hope. For young people who wondered if standing up mattered, it was a reminder that resistance, even in its quietest form, can echo across generations. The man himself grew older. His hair silvered, his steps slowed, but his presence carried the same gravity it always had. Children who visited his farm whispered about him with awe, as if he were not just a man, but a legend walking among them. He never claimed that title, never sought to be more than what he was. But when he spoke, people listened, not because his voice was loud, but because it carried the weight of someone who had lived his truth, even when it cost him everything. One evening, his grandson asked him a question that made him pause. The boy, barely 10, had wide, earnest eyes. "Grandpa," he said, "why did you open the dam? Weren't you scared?" The old man looked out over the fields, the setting sun painting them gold. He thought for a long moment before answering. "I wasn't scared of the water," he said quietly. "I was scared of what would happen if I did nothing. If I let them take the land, I'd be telling you, your father, and your children yet to come, that we don't matter, that our history doesn't matter. I would have been handing them permission to erase us. And that, he said, his voice steady, I could never allow. The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand. But years later, when he grew into a man, those words would root themselves deep within him. He would carry them like a compass, reminding him that silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of surrender. Years later, when the grandson who once asked that question became a man, he walked the fields with his own children. The ruins of the 35 homes were nearly gone, swallowed by grass and trees, but he pointed to the ground and told them the story. He spoke of the day the land spoke, of a man who refused to surrender, of the courage it takes to hold on to what is rightfully yours. And as he spoke, his children listened with wide eyes, just as he once had, carrying forward the flame of a legacy that would never be extinguished. And so the story became more than a man, more than a flood, more than 35 ruined homes. It became a reminder that dignity is not given, it is claimed. That history is not erased when it lives in the hearts of those who remember, and that when injustice rises like a tide, there are always those willing to open the dam and let the truth flow. Decades passed, and the story of the man who opened the dam was no longer just a family memory. It had become folklore, retold in living rooms, classrooms, and community halls far from the small southern town where it began. With each retelling, it took on the weight of parable, a reminder of what happens when pride, dignity, and history are threatened by greed. For his grandchildren, growing up in the shadow of that legacy was both a burden and a blessing. On one hand, the world often reduced them to the descendants of the man who flooded the homes. On the other, they carried with them the quiet pride of knowing that their bloodline had carved its story into the conscience of the nation. Whenever they walked the land, now restored with fields of corn and orchards of peaches, they felt not just ownership but stewardship. The soil beneath their feet seemed to hum with the voices of those who came before. The grandson who once asked, "Weren't you scared?" had grown into a man of his own strength. He became a teacher not of mathematics or science, but of history. His classroom walls were lined with photographs of black farmers, sharecroppers, and landowners, faces forgotten by textbooks but alive in his lessons. At the center of his teaching was the story of his grandfather, not as an act of destruction, but as an act of reclamation. His students, some wide-eyed and curious, others weary from lives already touched by injustice, listened as he explained that land was more than property. It was the foundation of freedom. But his work extended beyond the classroom. He joined with activists and organizers, traveling to communities where black families were still fighting to keep their land against developers, banks, and city councils. Whenever he spoke, he carried his grandfather's story like a torch, lighting fires of courage in those who felt powerless. The land remembers who it belongs to, he would tell them. But it needs your voice. It needs you to stand. The movement grew, slowly but surely. Scholars wrote books about black land loss, citing his grandfather's act as a turning point in public consciousness. Lawmakers, pressured by activists, began drafting policies to protect family-owned land from predatory seizure. Not all change came quickly, and many battles were still lost. But something undeniable had shifted. Where once there had been silence, there was now a chorus demanding justice. Back on the land, the dam remained. It had been repaired, reinforced, and modernized by the family, not to destroy but to preserve. Where once it symbolized defiance, it now stood as a monument. Visitors came from across the country to see it, to hear the story of the man who had used it not as a weapon but as a voice. The family built a small visitor center nearby, where photographs, documents, and oral histories were preserved. It became a place of learning, reflection, and pride not only for them, but for all who carried the weight of stolen land in their history. One evening, under a sky streaked with stars, the grandson stood by the dam with his own daughter. She was just a teenager, full of questions and restless energy. "Daddy," she asked, "do you think Grandpa was right? I mean, couldn't he have done something else?" He smiled gently, hearing echoes of his own childhood question in hers. "Maybe," he admitted. "Maybe there were other ways. But you have to understand, the world didn't listen to him. They dismissed him, erased him, told him he didn't matter. Sometimes, when you've been silenced too long, you have to speak in a way the world cannot ignore." That's what he did. He forced them to see. His daughter looked out at the water, its surface reflecting the moonlight. "Do you think people will remember him forever?" she asked softly. The man placed a hand on her shoulder. They'll remember what he stood for. And that's more important than remembering his name. In that moment, the legacy shifted again. Not just a story of the past, but a lesson for the future. The act of opening the dam was no longer only about resistance. It was about teaching generations to value dignity above comfort, justice above convenience, and truth above silence. As the years stretched on, the land flourished. The fields fed families, the orchards produced sweet fruit, and the dam provided water for crops and life. What had once been a site of conflict became a sanctuary. Families who had lost land elsewhere came to visit, to walk the fields, to touch the soil, to draw strength from its story. For them, it was proof that not all was lost, that sometimes the land fights back through the people who love it. When the grandson's time finally came to leave this world, he asked only one thing of his children: to keep the land no matter the cost. Guard it, he told them, his voice faint but firm. Not just because it's ours, but because it tells a story. And stories like this must never die. They buried him beside his grandfather, the two men lying in the earth they had defended in their own ways. And as the family gathered, the preacher said words that echoed through the generations. This land is more than inheritance. It is testimony. Testimony to the strength of a people who refuse to be erased. And so the story stretched beyond them all, moving through time like water, steady, unstoppable, eternal. The dam stood, the land thrived, and the memory of the man who once opened the floodgates remained alive, not just in history books, but in the hearts of all who understood what it meant to fight for dignity. The world had changed. The fields were still there, the dam still strong, but the air around the land felt different now. Where once men with clipboards and paper maps had come, now drones flew overhead snapping images for developers. Where once bulldozers had rumbled down dirt roads, now glossy proposals arrived by email, promising revitalization and urban expansion. The language had changed, but the intent was the same: to take what had been nurtured by one family for generations and turn it into profit. The great-grandchildren of the man who opened the dam were no longer farmers alone. They were lawyers, engineers, teachers, artists, each carrying a piece of his spirit in their work. But every time they returned to the land, every time they stood on the soil where their ancestor had once stood in defiance, they felt the same call: to protect, to preserve, to remember. Pressure came swiftly. A corporation, backed by investors from out of state, announced plans to buy up land around them for a sprawling luxury resort. They spoke of jobs, tourism, and progress, but the family recognized the signs. They had seen this story before. Offers arrived, generous ones, promising the family more money than they had ever seen in a single lifetime. Some relatives were tempted. Others were furious at the very suggestion. Meetings turned into heated debates, voices raised, tears shed. But through it all, the memory of their great-grandfather hung like a banner over them. One night, as rain tapped against the windows, the family gathered in the old farmhouse. The youngest among them, a college student named Isaiah, pulled out his phone. "You all don't see what's happening," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "They're not just trying to buy us out. They're trying to erase us again. But this time, we have something Grandpa never had. We have a voice the whole world can hear." He opened a video on his phone, a short clip he had filmed of the land, the dam, the graves where their ancestors rested. Over it, he had recorded his voice, telling the story of the man who once opened the floodgates. He posted it online, and within days it spread. Millions watched. Some wept, others raged, but all were moved. Strangers from across the globe left comments: "This land is sacred. Don't let them take it." Your grandfather's story is our story too. The family realized that the battle had entered a new arena. It was no longer only about courtrooms and contracts. It was about narrative, about who controlled the story. And for the first time, they held the advantage. The corporation was not prepared for the backlash. Their polished press releases fell flat against the raw, powerful weight of the family's story. News outlets picked it up, linking the modern fight to the historical one. Activists rallied behind them, organizing petitions, marches, and fundraisers. Students wore shirts that read, "The land spoke once, it will speak again." Isaiah became the unlikely face of the movement, his words echoing on podcasts, documentaries, and televised interviews. But he never claimed the spotlight for himself. "I'm just telling my great-grandfather's story," he would say. "The real power is in the land and in the people who refuse to let it be stolen." Still, the fight was not easy. The corporation used lawyers, lobbyists, and every tactic at their disposal. They tried to discredit the family, painting them as stubborn and unreasonable. They sent surveyors at dawn, hoping to intimidate. They even threatened legal loopholes that could strip the family of water rights from the dam, but the family held firm. They had learned from the past that silence was dangerous. They attended city council meetings in force, bringing not only documents and deeds, but photographs of their ancestors, their story told in trembling voices that filled the chambers with truth. They reminded officials that progress cannot be built on stolen ground. And once again, the land itself seemed to stand with them. A heavy storm season swelled the dam, the water rushing so loudly that it sounded like a roar. Standing by the floodgates, Isaiah thought of his great-grandfather. He whispered into the wind, "We won't let it happen again." The struggle stretched on for months, then years. But slowly momentum shifted. Public opinion turned sharply against the corporation. Investors pulled out, unwilling to be tied to a project branded as an assault on Black legacy. Eventually, the resort plan was abandoned. The land once again remained in the family's hands. Victory, however, did not lead to complacency. The great-grandchildren knew the fight would never truly be over. The pressures would always return in different forms under different names, but they also knew something their ancestor had proven long ago. When the land is defended with dignity, it cannot be easily erased. In the end, they decided not to guard the story for themselves alone. They opened the visitor center into a full cultural heritage site, a place where anyone could come and learn the history of Black land ownership, resilience, and struggle. They taught children about the flood, about the court battles, about the resilience of one man who stood when no one believed in him. And they taught them that resistance comes in many forms, with water, with words, with unity. On the centennial of the flood, the family gathered at the dam. The sky glowed orange with sunset, and the water shimmered like glass. Isaiah, now older, stood with his own children. He told them the story as it had been told to him, as it had been told to every generation since. And as he spoke, the dam hummed softly behind him, the water's endless rhythm echoing the heartbeat of a legacy that refused to die. "The world will keep trying," he told them, his voice low and steady. "They'll keep coming for what isn't theirs. But remember this, dignity is worth more than comfort, and truth flows stronger than any current. This land is not just where we live, it's who we are. And as long as the water runs, so will our story." The children nodded, their young faces lit by the fading light. And in that moment, the past, present, and future seemed to merge. One family, one land, one unbroken chain of resistance stretching into eternity. The land had spoken once. It would speak again. Time has a way of turning stories into legends and legends into guiding lights. By the middle of the next century, the tale of the man who opened the dam was no longer confined to one family, one town, or even one region. It had grown into a story of national importance, studied in schools, debated in universities, and remembered in ceremonies that honored the resilience of Black families who had defended their land against all odds. The farm itself, still held by the family, had become something far larger than anyone once imagined. No longer just fields and orchards. It had grown into the heritage grounds for land justice, a sprawling cultural center where history, art, and activism intertwined. Families traveled from across the country to walk the paths, to touch the soil, and to tell their own stories of survival. Children stood in awe before the dam, now preserved like a monument, its iron gates polished and engraved with words that had become a mantra. The land remembers. Isaiah's children, now grown and gray, had taken on the mantle of guardianship. They no longer needed to fight. Bulldozers or corporations, those battles, had shifted to courtrooms. Legislatures and policies. The struggle had evolved, but it remained. Developers still sought to displace the poor, still cloaked greed in the language of progress. But because of the family's legacy, there were now laws directly inspired by the flood that protected ancestral land from being seized without consent. What had once been an isolated act of defiance had become the seed of a legal framework that stretched across the nation. Each year, on the anniversary of the flood, thousands gathered at the dam. The event was not a festival, but a solemn observance. Elders told stories, musicians sang songs born of struggle, and children placed flowers in the water, watching them float downstream as a tribute to those who had been erased and those who had resisted. And always the family stood at the front, not as owners, but as keepers of memory. Yet even as the story was celebrated, the family never let it be smoothed into comfort. They reminded visitors that their great-grandfather's act had not been easy, nor simple, nor without pain. It was born of desperation, of injustice, of a silence so deep that only water could break it. They warned against romanticizing the flood, without remembering the suffering it represented. For them, it was not only about pride, it was about vigilance. In schools across America, children learned the story not as a myth, but as history. Textbooks placed it alongside the long line of black resistance, alongside Harriet Tubman's journeys, Frederick Douglass's words, Rosa Parks's defiance, and the marches of the civil rights movement. Teachers spoke of the flood as a turning point, a reminder that even one man standing alone could shift the tides of history when he carried the weight of his ancestors behind him. Technology, too, carried the legacy forward. The story was recreated in films, virtual reality experiences, and immersive exhibits. Students could stand in simulated fields, hear the groan of the dam's gates, feel the rush of the water, and understand, if only for a moment, what it meant to hold dignity above fear. Some worried that such digitization diluted the sacredness of the act. But the family chose to see it as another form of storytelling, another way for the world to listen. Generations later, his descendants no longer introduced themselves only by their names. They carried with pride the phrase, "I am of the land that spoke." It was more than identity, it was responsibility. Wherever they went, whether into politics, art, medicine, or law, they carried the lessons of the flood. They stood against exploitation, against greed disguised as progress, against silence in the face of injustice. But the family also knew that history has a way of repeating itself. One year, whispers began to rise again. New technologies that allowed corporations to seize land through loopholes, claiming climate initiatives or infrastructure necessity. Though wrapped in modern justifications, it was the same old story, the powerful reaching for what was not theirs. The great-great-granddaughter of the man who opened the dam, now a senator, stood on the floor of Congress with his story burning in her voice. She spoke not as a politician alone, but as the heir to a truth. My great-grandfather showed this country what happens when you ignore the dignity of those who have tended the land for generations, she said, her words echoing through chambers where too often greed had ruled. We will not allow history to be rewritten. We will not allow the soil of our ancestors to be stolen again. The flood taught us once. Do not force the land to speak again. Her speech ignited something larger than policy. It sparked a movement. Across the country, communities began reclaiming lost lands, reviving farms, planting seeds not only in soil, but in the consciousness of a people long denied their roots. They called it the flow of justice movement, honoring the flood that had once washed away arrogance and restored dignity. Back at the dam, the family continued to gather, each generation passing the story to the next. Children sat cross-legged in the grass, their eyes wide as they listened. Elders pointed to the water, teaching them to see not just ripples, but memory. And when those children grew into adults, they told the same story to their children, ensuring that the chain would never break. The man who opened the dam was long gone, his body resting in the soil he defended. But his spirit was everywhere, in the whisper of the water, in the strength of the trees, in the pride of his descendants, in the laws that now bore his legacy. He had once been just a man standing alone against impossible odds. But through time, through courage, through memory, he had become something eternal. And so the land endured, the dam endured, the family endured, and the story, like the water itself, flowed on, unbroken, unstoppable, forever. There comes a time when stories outgrow the boundaries of history, when the line between fact and myth blurs, and what remains is not simply what happened, but what it means. The man who once stood before a dam and chose to release, the waters had long since become more than a farmer, more than a father, more than a defender of his land. By the 22nd century, his image, his name, and his defiance carried the weight of prophecy. People called him by many titles: the keeper of the flow, the man who made the land speak, the prophet of water. In black communities across the globe, his act was remembered as a symbol of dignity, refusing to bow to greed. In Africa, griots wove his defiance into their oral traditions, linking him to centuries of resistance against colonizers who had taken gold, diamonds, oil, and men. In the Caribbean, his story merged with ancient tales of rivers that swallowed oppressors and carried the cries of the enslaved into the ocean. In South America, liberation movements invoked his flood as a sign that the earth itself stands with the oppressed, no longer just a tale of one family's struggle, It became a parable repeated in prayer circles, whispered in protests painted on murals, and sung in gospel refrains. For some, he was a man. For others, he had become something greater, an ancestral spirit, who lived wherever injustice threatened the land or its people. Pilgrims came from every corner of the world to stand before the dam. They came barefoot, carrying jars of water from their own rivers, their own homelands, and poured them into the reservoir as offerings. They believed the waters mingled there held power, not magic, but memory, a force stronger than any law. Priests and pastors, imams and shamans, rabbis and monks stood side by side at the water's edge, each seeing in the story a reflection of their own struggle, their own yearning for justice. Over time, the act of opening the dam was retold in a way that stretched beyond its physical details. Some said the water did not just drown homes, but washed away lies, revealing truth long buried. Others said the flood did not destroy, but purified, like baptism on a scale vast enough for a nation's conscience. The story grew luminous, layered, alive, not bound by the limits of what had been, but rising into what must always be remembered. Artists depicted him with hands outstretched, palms stained with earth and water, standing between two worlds, the one of silence and the one of truth. Poets compared him to Moses striking the rock, unleashing life-giving waters for his people. Philosophers argued that his act was the purest form of resistance, a reminder that when systems refuse to listen, the earth itself will roar on behalf of the oppressed. And still, at the heart of the legend, there remained his family. Though centuries had passed, they did not let the world forget the man behind the myth. They told his story in full, his tired hands, his quiet prayers, the years of endurance before that fateful day. They reminded pilgrims and poets alike that he was not born a prophet. He was a man pressed against the wall by injustice, who found the courage to act. They wanted the world to remember his humanity, not just his legend. Yet even as they insisted on the truth, they could not deny the mystery that lingered in his legacy. For how else could one explain the way the story resonated across cultures, across faiths, across centuries? How else could one explain the way the flood seemed to echo in struggles, far removed from its waters? In the deserts of Africa, activists fighting against corporations, draining their wells, carried banners with his likeness, declaring, "We too will open the dam." In the crowded streets of Asia, where families resisted forced evictions for development projects, his story was invoked as a warning: if you do not listen, the flood will come. In the islands threatened by rising seas, his name was spoken in both fear and faith, a symbol of the power of water, both destructive and cleansing. And so his story lived not just as memory, but as prophecy. Not a prediction of disaster, but a reminder that when the dignity of the poor is ignored, the land will not remain silent. The flood is always waiting. Generations later, scholars would debate whether the story had grown too large, too mythic, too far removed from the man himself. But the people knew better. They understood that myths are not lies. They are truths wrapped in symbols, truths too vast for simple history to contain. And the truth of his act was this: that dignity is more powerful than wealth, that silence is never eternal, and that the oppressed will always find a way to speak, if not with voices, then with the earth itself. In one telling, passed down in whispered prayers, it was said that on the night before he opened the dam, the man dreamt of his ancestors. He saw them standing along the banks of the river, his grandfather, his great-grandmother, faces stretching back through centuries of bondage, toil, and exile. They did not speak, but they placed their hands upon his shoulders. And he awoke with the strength of generations flowing through him. Whether that dream was real or imagined mattered little. It became part of the story, part of the prophecy, that no act of courage is ever carried alone, that the living are always joined by the unseen hands of those who came before. And so, the man who had once been just one farmer became more than a figure in history. He became a symbol of the eternal truth that the earth remembers, that justice may be delayed but not denied, and that the waters of dignity, once released, can never be dammed again. And when the world needed courage, when new generations faced new oppressions, they turned once more to the story. They spoke his name. They remembered the flood. They told themselves and each other, the land remembers, the waters flow, and we are not alone. Centuries passed, yet the story of the man who opened the dam did not fade. Instead, it transformed. What began as an act of desperation became legend, and what became legend grew into scripture. The tale was no longer bound by borders or cultures. It lived in the marrow of humanity's shared struggle, the eternal clash between dignity and greed, silence and voice, oppression and freedom. By the 24th century, the story was read not only in classrooms or whispered at vigils, it was etched into the fabric of humanity's spiritual imagination. Temples and churches, mosques and synagogues, meditation halls and sacred groves all retold the parable of the flood in their own tongues, their own cadences, their own rituals. In each tradition, the details shifted slightly, but the essence remained. When power grows arrogant and the oppressed are silenced, the earth itself will rise to defend its children. Some called it the scripture of water. Others named it the testament of the land. But no matter what language, no matter what creed, the story became a kind of sacred mirror, showing every people their own struggle and their own possibility of triumph. In Africa, worshippers poured libations into rivers, calling upon the spirit of the keeper of the flow as both ancestor and guardian. In South America, liberation theologians read the story alongside the Gospels, declaring it a modern exodus, a reminder that God speaks not only through prophets but through soil, rain, and rivers. In Asia, the parable blended into Buddhist and Taoist teachings, representing harmony restored when human greed breaks the balance of nature. In the Middle East, it was spoken in Friday sermons as a warning that justice delayed is justice demanded by creation itself. The family's descendants, long since interwoven with the fabric of nations, continued to gather at the dam. It had become more than a monument, it was a shrine. Pilgrims came by the millions, carrying water from their own homes, pouring it into the reservoir and whispering prayers. Scientists, historians, and theologians worked together to preserve the site, not as museum or theme park, but as sanctuary. For here was proof of a truth too deep for archives, that a single man, armed with nothing but courage and history, could alter the course of centuries. Yet even as it grew sacred, the family held fast to one principle. They refused to let the man be worshipped as a god. They reminded the world that he was flesh and blood, bone and struggle, weariness and resolve. He was their ancestor, not their deity. His greatness lay not in being otherworldly, but in being fully human, fully vulnerable, yet unwilling to surrender dignity. That, they said, was the miracle. That was what must endure. In time, a universal prayer emerged, spoken in dozens of languages, but always carrying the same refrain. The land remembers. The waters flow. Justice endures. Children memorized it as easily as they learned their alphabet. Leaders invoked it when swearing oaths. Communities sang it when marching for rights. Families whispered it when planting seeds in the earth. It was no longer just a story of the past. It had become humanity's compass, pointing always toward dignity, toward resistance, toward balance with the world itself. And still the story deepened. Mystics taught that the flood was more than a historical event. It was a parable of the soul. Just as water broke the silence of injustice, so too could courage break the silence of fear within every heart. To open the dam, they said, was to choose truth over comfort, dignity over survival, eternity over the temporary. Every person, in their own life, carried a dam within them, walls of silence, walls of fear, walls of compromise. And every person at some point must decide whether to open the gates and let their truth flow. Thus, the man who once stood alone on his land became a prophet not of one people, but of all humanity. His story guided farmers protecting their fields, activists challenging corruption, teachers shaping young minds, and even scientists exploring the balance between humanity and nature. He was remembered not as savior but as example, not as divine but as dignified. And in that humility lay his immortality. The dam itself, though ancient, still stood. It no longer functioned as machinery of flood or farm. It had become pure symbol, preserved by engineers and caretakers as the world's most sacred ruin. Its gates, once rusted, were polished bronze, engraved with the words, "If you silence the people, the land will speak." On certain nights, when the moon shone on the water, pilgrims swore they could hear whispers, voices of ancestors, voices of the silenced, voices of the oppressed from every age. Whether those whispers were real or imagined did not matter. They were truth all the same. And so the story reached its highest form. It was no longer just history, no longer just heritage, no longer just legend. It was scripture, not in the sense of divine command, but in the sense of eternal guidance. A story that belonged to no one family, no one people, but to the entire human race. The man who opened the dam had become eternal not through miracles, but through memory. His act had flowed across centuries like the very waters he released. Unstoppable, uncontainable, and everlasting. And in the end, what did the story teach? That dignity is greater than fear. That silence is never final. That the earth itself stands as witness to justice. And that though one man may pass, the waters of his courage will flow forever. The land remembers. The waters flow. Justice endures. And humanity at last remembered with it. 1,000 years had passed since the man opened the dam. Kingdoms had risen and fallen. Empires had stretched and collapsed. Technologies had advanced beyond imagination. Yet through it all, the story endured. No archive of data, no monument of steel, no empire of wealth had survived untouched by time. But the parable of the flood flowed on, carried by memory, by ritual, by song. By the 30th century, humanity was no longer bound only to the earth. Cities floated above the oceans. Colonies stretched across the moon and Mars, and even the outer stations of Jupiter held human voices. And still, wherever people went, they carried the story of the man who refused to let his land be stolen. His name was spoken in orbit, sung in domes built on deserts of red dust, whispered in prayer beneath alien stars. In one lunar colony, a great mural stretched across the inner wall of a dome. It depicted the earth, blue and fragile, and upon it a solitary figure, standing at the gates of a dam, arms wide as water burst forth. Children born on the moon, who had never touched soil or river, pointed to that mural as their first lesson in justice. Their teachers explained, "This is who we are. This is why we exist. Because once long ago, a man taught us that dignity is greater than fear. On Mars, settlers brought vials of earth from the ancestral dam, preserved for centuries by caretakers. They sprinkled it into the first canals of melted ice, believing the soil carried the strength of generations. Engineers laughed at the ritual, but farmers swore the crops grew stronger where the earth was placed. Scientists dismissed it as myth. The people called it memory. And on Earth itself, where climate had shifted and coastlines had redrawn, the dam still stood. Protected for over 1,000 years, it had become humanity's oldest shrine, older than cathedrals, older than pyramids, older than empires. Pilgrims still came, though the journey was no longer easy. They walked for days, rode ships, even descended from orbit, to stand before the gates where one man had changed history. They brought water not only from rivers, but from ice caps, from melted Martian snow, from seas light years away. They poured it into the reservoir as offerings, believing the dam now held not only the memory of one people, but of all humanity. The story had changed, as stories always do. Some cultures remembered the man as prophet, others as ancestor, still others as symbol of Earth itself, rising against injustice. In one retelling, he was the last farmer of a dying age, teaching humanity to honor the soil before it was too late. In another, he was not a man at all, but the earth in human form, opening the gates of truth. In still another, he was nameless, faceless, simply the one who opened. But no matter the telling, the essence remained. And as humanity reached for the stars, the story became more than remembrance. It became a covenant. Leaders swore upon it before building new cities. Colonists read it aloud before breaking new soil. Children memorized it as their first lesson in ethics. If you silence the people, they recited, the land will speak. But on Mars, they replaced land with soil. In orbit, they said the stars. On Waterworld colonies, they said the sea. The words adapted, but the truth did not change. For even in the age of stars, greed endured. Corporations sought to strip planets bare. Leaders sought to claim power at the cost of dignity, and the old dangers of arrogance returned in new disguises. But wherever injustice rose, so too did the parable. Protesters painted the flood across domes and ships. Families whispered it before standing against exploitation. And in moments of despair, when silence threatened to crush courage, people remembered the waters always wait. The man himself was no longer remembered as ancestor alone. He had become symbol, myth, scripture, covenant, and prophecy all at once. And yet, in quiet corners of Earth, his descendants still lived. They still returned to the dam, tending it not as museum, but as memory. Though the world called their ancestor a prophet, they called him simply grandfather. They lit candles on the banks, told stories to their children, and reminded them that beneath all the myth, there was still one man, weary and resolute, who chose dignity over fear. And in those moments, the story came full circle. For even in an age of stars, when humanity could reshape planets and walk among the constellations, the truth remained simple, eternal, unshakable. That dignity is sacred, that silence can be broken, that the earth remembers, that the waters flow. And so, thousands of years after the flood, Beneath alien skies and distant suns, the story endured. Not as relic, not as nostalgia, but as living scripture, a compass for all who struggled, a river that never ceased to flow. And perhaps one day, when humanity reached further than stars, when they stood at the edge of eternity itself, they would carry that story still. For the flood was never just about land or water, it was about what it means to be human. And that truth, unlike empires, unlike machines, unlike even planets, would never die. Time does not stop for nations, nor for empires, nor even for civilizations. Just as rivers carve valleys and winds shape mountains, so too does time shape the destiny of humanity. Millennia passed. Humanity spread across planets, built empires among stars, and then, as all living things must, waned. Some colonies fell silent. Some worlds were abandoned. Even Earth itself, scarred and weathered by centuries of struggle, entered a long silence. And yet the story endured. When the last pilgrims stood before the dam, they did not come as conquerors or as heirs to power. They came as keepers of memory, whispering prayers not for themselves but for the story itself, so it might live even when they were gone. They poured their waters into the reservoir, as their ancestors had done for thousands of years, and left knowing the tradition would outlast them. For though humanity faded, the earth remembered. The dam, though ancient, remained. Weathered stone and rusted gates stood like bones of memory. The reservoir, though smaller with age, still held water, still reflected the sky. Winds swept across it, carrying whispers, perhaps of pilgrims long gone, perhaps of ancestors unseen, perhaps of the earth itself, breathing its eternal truth. And so, even when the voices of men and women grew quiet, the land continued the story. The rivers carried it in their currents. The mountains echoed it in their silence. The winds whispered it through forests that still stood. And the seas, eternal and vast, remembered the moment when one man's courage broke the silence of oppression. Far beyond Earth, fragments of the story had traveled with humanity into the stars, inscribed on tablets of steel, etched into crystal, encoded into light. The parable of the flood drifted between worlds. Even when colonies fell and civilizations crumbled, echoes of the story lingered, on ruined domes, on broken satellites, on ancient databanks left behind in forgotten orbits. Perhaps one day another people, far different from humanity, would find those fragments. Perhaps they would read the words, "If you silence the people, the land will speak." And though they would not know the language, the essence would endure. For the story was never about one people alone. It was about dignity, about the earth, about the eternal balance between power and justice. In this way, the man who once stood before a dam became more than ancestor, more than prophet, more than scripture. He became eternal truth, a force no civilization could erase. His act was no longer just remembered, it was woven into the fabric of existence itself. For rivers will always remember. For soil will always carry the footsteps of those who walked it. For waters, once released, can never be dammed again. The story was not buried in time. It became time itself, flowing endlessly like the rivers, unbound by beginning or end. And though humanity may pass, the story flowed on, ready for whoever would come after, whether of flesh or spirit or stars. And so it ended. And so it began. The man stood. The gates opened. The waters flowed. The land remembers. The waters flow. Justice endures forever.